guys and gals? It's your buddy Drew with Living History's Mysteries and Ferocious Feline Productions. You know, for a long time, I have been wanting to do something on one of the most mysterious, notorious serial killers the world has ever known. Of course, I'm talking about Jack the Ripper. Believe it or not, evidence was actually provided right here in the 21st century to the actual identity of who the Ripper was. But of course, historians, doctors, they all came up with excuses why the evidence provided wasn't viable. I'm going to tell you what, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here at the beginning. We'll talk a little bit more at the end. Let you guys make your own judgment. Check this out. This is good.
The story began back in the late 1800s in the largely poverty-stricken East End of London. During the mid-19th century, London's population began to swell with a large influx of Irish, Jewish, Russian and Eastern European immigrants. This in turn attributed to the already diminishing state of Whitechapel. Over half of the children who were born into these families died before the age of 5. Many jobs and houses were taken by the immigrants, and Londoners were pushed further into poverty. Women had taken to prostitution just to survive and bring small amounts back home to their starving families. One dark early morning at 2:30 a.m. on Tuesday the 7th of August 1888, the start of a terrifying crime spree began. After the August bank holiday in London, prostitute Martha Tabram was brutally murdered. She was stabbed an incredible 39 times. It was thought that this crime was committed by a local soldier. An identification parade was set up to try and find this killer, but this was unsuccessful. Martha Tabram was considered the first Jack the Ripper victim. Although her murder differs to his other murders, the connection has not been ruled out. Mary Ann Nichols was the second victim to be murdered by the infamous Jack the Ripper. She was also a prostitute. On the 31st of August in Whitechapel, her body was found early in the morning. Her throat had been cut twice and her torso was mutilated in a horrific way, with many violent slashes across her body, concentrating on the midriff area. The weapon seemed to differ from the first murder, and so detectives concluded that the murders were not connected. Later, this was dismissed due to the similarity in aggression towards prostitutes. The third woman to be murdered in this way was another prostitute called Annie Chapman. Her body was also mutilated. This happened on the 8th of September. She was attacked early in the morning, a seemingly scary time to be out in Whitechapel in the late 19th century. This murder took a sadistic turn. Annie's body was cut open and her intestines were stripped from her body and hung over her shoulders, as well as having her throat cut twice. Exactly the same as Mary Ann. That is how Annie was found at approximately 6 a.m. The police department now gathered the knife used was around 15 to 20 centimetres long, and they suspected the murderer was possibly a doctor or someone with medical background because of the way Annie's insides were removed. Since there had been no real forward motion in solving this case, the police department had offered a reward for the catching of this killer. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were the next victims of Jack the Ripper. They were murdered on the same night. Although Elizabeth's body was not mutilated in the same way, her throat was cut twice and her body was still vaguely warm when found. Detectives think they had disturbed Jack the Ripper in the process of this murder, and this is why the body was not mutilated. However, a little less than an hour later on the same day, Catherine's body was found. This murder had the same markings of a Jack the Ripper murder. Her throat had been slashed and her body was mutilated. Her kidney and majority of her uterus was removed from her body. Catherine's face had also been mutilated, another step further than his previous victims. Many theories were being thrown around in the police departments. One disputed the fact that this was a lone killer. One disputed the fact that he had medical knowledge. All of these theories are still bandied around to this day. Mary Jane Kelly was to be the Ripper's next victim. Again, she had her throat slashed. Again, her internal organs were removed. Her breasts were cut off and her face was mutilated. It seems as though each victim was being mutilated just a little more than the previous. This mutilation happened behind Dorset Street, a street which had been familiar to a few of Jack the Ripper's previous victims. Yet another theory to be argued about within the police department. The three murders that followed were all put into the Whitechapel case file as being murders, but were not Jack the Ripper's usual MO. This included the death of Rose Mylett. She was strangled by her collar in Whitechapel early morning on December the 20th, 1888. The police originally thought that this was a terrible drunken accident, but this was put into the Whitechapel murder case file, as well as the murder of Alice Mackenzie. It was not confirmed if Alice was in fact a prostitute, but her murder was no less horrific than any of the other victims. Her body was found early morning on the 17th of July, 1889. She had her throat slashed like the other Jack the Ripper victims. She had also had slashes on her torso. These wounds were not considered the same as Jack the Ripper's, as a different weapon had been used, a much shorter knife, and so the wounds had not been as deep as the previous victims. The police had thought this was an imitation of a Jack the Ripper case, yet this was still unsolved and put into the Whitechapel murder case files. On Tuesday the 10th of September 1889, a torso was discovered in Whitechapel. No other body parts were found in or around the area after a long forensic search. The cause of death was not by a slashing of the throat, Ripper's main means to killing his victims. The police department again considered this to be a Whitechapel murder. Even though there had been two previous cases where torsos had been discovered with no other clue, and the torso discoveries were dubbed the killings of the Thames torso murderer. Another theory was that Jack the Ripper and the torso killer were the same person or working together. The last murder put into the Whitechapel murder file was that of Francis Coles. This was nearly 2 years on from the last cases in the file, in February 1891. Frances was a known prostitute working in Whitechapel. Her body was found under a railway arch. She had been violently pushed to the ground, and then her throat was cut in the same way Ripper's victims were usually killed. A man called James Sadler had been seen with Coles before her murder, and so he was arrested for this murder and was considered Jack the Ripper. But due to a lack of evidence, he was set free in March of that year. Nonetheless, these were only theories, as the murders to this day are unsolved. No cases after 1896 were put into the files, and so we can only assume the reason the Ripper stopped his murder spree. Maybe he was close to being caught. Maybe he himself died. Jack the Ripper spiked fear into poverty-stricken Whitechapel and the families who lived there in the late 19th century. It was a scary place to be if you were a prostitute working in London. Aaron Kosminski was born on the 11th of September 1865 in Klodowa, Poland. He was the son of Abram Joseph Kosminski, who was a tailor, and mother Golda Lubnowska. There were 4 children in total, 3 boys and 1 girl, who all lived together until the siblings emigrated to England in the 1880s. Their parents had decided to stay. The children all wanted a better life than they had in Poland. Aaron worked as a barber in the impoverished area of Whitechapel in the East End of London. In the 1880s, Aaron was not well known around Whitechapel, and although he was a barber, he wasn't practicing and never actively looked for work. He lived with his sister Matilda and brother-in-law for the time that he was in London. He had started to display some very concerning behaviours, which in turn worried his family. There wasn't much information on Aaron from his arrival in London in the early 1880s. The only known information we have is when Aaron was put into a mental institute after he threatened a woman with a knife, the chosen weapon of the Ripper. He then spent time at the Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum for around 3 years, and then he was transferred to the Leavesden Asylum. At the time that Aaron was in London, horrifying murders had started to take place in Whitechapel by a mysterious figure who had been named Jack the Ripper. Police, as we know, didn't have many suspects for these murders, but one name had been put into the case files along the way as a possibility of being the Ripper, was Kosminski. There was no forename given, and he was named as a Polish Jew, and it also stated that he had been in a lunatic asylum. But no further clues were formed from this, and it was just put in the files, then filed as no further action, along with many other papers naming people as feasible suspects. The only Ripper murder that doesn't fit in with Aaron's timeline in London is that of Frances Coles. She was found in November 1891. Aaron was in the Leavesden Asylum from February 1891, but a sailor was arrested and charged with Frances's murder. The sailor was not charged with any of the other Ripper murders. This information can add to the ever-growing list of reasons that Aaron could be the Ripper, or it could diminish it if you were to believe that Frances Coles was in fact a Ripper victim. The next factual information we have for Aaron was when he was brought to the Mile End Old Town Workhouse on the 12th of July 1890, then was released just 3 days after. He was then readmitted by his brother-in-law in early 1891 and held until he was transferred to Colney Hatch after a diagnosis of mental insanity. The notes from the asylum did not name him as Aaron Kosminski, but that of David Cohen, a name which was better understood and a name often used for Polish Jews. Cohen was also a name that had been mentioned in the Ripper case files. He was brought into the institution at the same time the murders had finished. He was said to be a violent and disturbed man who was angry at prostitutes for the passing of syphilis on to him. Although this was not put on the death certificate as a cause of death, Aaron or David died in the institute in March 1919, aged 53. Aaron's name was much later put into the frame for the Jack the Ripper murders. In 2014, a DNA expert had been able to extract some DNA from a piece of material, a shawl maybe, of Catherine Eddowes, one of Jack the Ripper's many victims. She was murdered on the 30th of September 1888. The DNA was to match that of the female line of Kosminski descendants, and also put with the papers which had been filed stating that a man named as Kosminski was a possible suspect. We seem to have made a credible link and increased the reasons for him to be a suspect for the Ripper murders. This has been disputed by many, stating that the shawl was found near to Catherine Eddowes and was not necessarily owned by her. The shawl was bought at an auction and so could have passed through many hands, leaving lots of DNA on it. The DNA experiment was also not verified by any other scientist to corroborate the findings. This is the usual protocol for this kind of experiment. The fact that the Ripper murders stopped at the time Aaron was put into the institute, along with the reasons that he was put into the institute in the first place, a danger to himself and others, difficult to deal with, dominant, deluded, incoherent and apathetic to name a few, all point to the mind of an unstable man with a killer's instinct. Unfortunately, there has been no further information on this theory, so we'll have to make our own mind up to who we think Jack the Ripper was. If you have any thoughts on this subject, please leave a comment and we can leave this open for debate.
Welcome back. You know, it's like I said in the beginning, there's a lot of mystery around how the Ripper could have done what he done. He always appeared out of nowhere and vanished into the night. Of course, Whitechapel was not the safest place to live during that time. And sadly, because of the economics of the time, a lot of women had to become ladies of the night just to support themselves or themselves and their families. It was a sad time in London's past. But if it was ever truly solved, would it still remain one of history's greatest mysteries? Y'all take care.